Thank you all very much indeed for joining this SFT Zoom webinar discussion on gene editing. I'm going to be moderating, and it would be fair to say, and I should acknowledge this immediately, that I'm hardly an impartial moderator. Anybody who's read my blog, which is on the SFT website, will know that I have deep concerns about gene editing. But for the purposes of this session, I'm going to try to be as fair and as impartial as I reasonably can, given that I've already declared where I'm coming from. Just a word about me. I'm founder and chief executive of the Sustainable Food Trust. I'm a practicing farmer, and I milked the cows this morning. We've got a herd of Ayrshires here, and along the road of our 47 years on this farm, we've grown carrots, we continue to grow cereals, and we breed from our cows. And those practices continue to involve technological interventions, if we can put it that way, which are not without discussion points. Just to give you a few examples, we are currently using sexed semen to try to select heifers from our dairy cows. When we grew carrots, we grew mostly F1 varieties, and I'm definitely not anti-science. I've had my jab, all that sort of thing. So I just want to say that although I'm deeply concerned about gene editing, I don't have some sort of ideological objection to technology. Having said that, this is the last I'll say about my views. I would go to extreme lengths to avoid introducing gene-edited plants and animals on this farm. So now to this discussion. I'm particularly delighted, and I feel it's very generous of him that Professor Gideon Henderson has agreed to join this discussion at very short notice. He's chief scientist at DEPRA, and his affiliation is with Oxford University. He's professor of earth sciences there. We also have, and he will speak first. Thank you very much for joining at short notice, Gideon. Secondly, we have Michael Antonio, who is head of gene expression therapy and reader in molecular genetics at King's College in London. Thirdly, we have Guy Singh Watson, who hardly needs an introduction. He's the founder of Riverford Organic. And we have Lawrence Woodward, who is founder of Beyond GM, co-founder of Whole Health Agriculture, and prior to that, for many years, director of Elm Farm Research Centre, which then became the Organic Research Centre. So those are our speakers. Again, I want to stress, it's not a balanced representation of views, but hopefully the conversation that we have will be respectful, intellectually rigorous, but not the wrong side of, abrasive or whatever you want to call it. So I'm now going to introduce Gideon Henderson. Gideon, the floor is yours. Thank you so much for attending again, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Thanks very much, Patrick, and thank you for the invitation. It's always a pleasure to talk to groups like this, and I realise that I might be in hostile territory, but I very much welcome hearing views from everyone in this subject. Patrick, you started off by saying a little bit about your day job, and I think because Fridays are technically my University of Oxford day, I think I'm going to do the same and say just a little bit about where I'm coming from as an individual here before talking about the gene editing issue. I'm an environmental scientist, and part of my reason for applying science in the environment, part of my reason for going into the subject is because I have a deep-seated love of the environment. I walk and I cycle, I get out a lot. I'm very aware of nature around me. I may not be a farmer, but I have a love of nature. And I'm very aware of the major challenges that we face now in the climate crisis and in the significant biodiversity loss that we continue to experience, and how we've got to, as a society, deal with those challenges in the coming years and decades. So that gives a little bit of a background. I think it'd be good if you could think of me not as a as a scientist in a white lab coat and a pipette, but as a scientist who gets out into the field in lots of different settings or on research ships and is engaged with nature in the way that I do my research and have done it for decades, trying to understand that natural system. And it's really out of that love of nature and my experience of working in nature and bringing science to nature that I personally am excited about the prospects of gene editing for crops and for livestock. And that's because I see quite significant benefits that might be derived from application of gene editing to build products which have use for sustainability and for support of nature. Some of the products that we might build, in fact, have already been built in some other countries, in Argentina and Japan or other countries which allow gene editing for crop production, include products which have a natural pest or disease resistance, and therefore would lower our use of pesticides and support biodiversity in the environment. There are other gene editing approaches that would lower nutrient usage. And of course, nutrients and their overuse is often what pollutes our streams and our air. And NO2, of course, is a greenhouse gas and contributing to the climate change. So decreasing nutrients is a continual goal, and gene editing might help. As climate warms, as it already is, we're seeing stress to our crop systems, perhaps particularly in the tropics and the developing world. And gene editing will help us to build crops that can resist drought or thrive under heat stress. So it's also enhancing the resilience of our crop systems and sustainability that way. It's also true that gene editing can increase productivity and therefore decrease the land area that we need to use for food production so that we can rewild or grow trees or find other uses of our land. So there's a host of environmental benefits that can come from application of gene editing. And those are really the reasons why I, as an environmental scientist, are particularly enthusiastic. There are also benefits about gene editing for human health, and I won't dwell on them much, but you can build products which have higher vitamin content or lower toxin content as through the application of gene editing. Now, gene editing is a way of mimicking what can be done naturally. It can mimic the process of breeding. Breeding would also enable us to build these crops, but building is scientifically quite a clunky process. You often have to stress the genome of the thing you're breeding in ways that lead to many off-target interventions, off-target changes. And it's slow as well. You can take decades or longer to produce a crop in the way that you want it to behave. And the wonderful thing about gene editing is it's extremely precise. So you can make the exact change that you want to, and also that it's very much quicker. So you can produce the crops to achieve those environmental benefits much more quickly than you can by natural breeding. But genetically, in many of the situations that you might apply gene editing, the outcome is really exactly the same. It's indistinguishable genetically. So the benefits, I think, are scientifically fairly clear. I think, therefore, there is at least worth careful consideration that there's a place for gene editing as part of our food system, part of a diverse system that would still include many other ways of growing food, but as one way of broadening that and making it more sustainable and more environmentally robust. Now, I should say that that's a positive view, and I recognise in saying it that there are some serious issues that would need to be sorted out before gene editing could be applied, and these are issues that have been sorted out in other countries where it is applied for crop and livestock use. Perhaps I'd say that the top three of the areas where we need careful attention is, first of all, on regulation. We still need to be able to regulate the products that are made through this approach. You can't just throw them out there. You need to know how you are going to look after these products as they go out into the field and into the food system. The second thing that needs to be thought about is intellectual property. Who owns the right to the products that are made this way? And that needs a great deal of care. You don't want, I think most people would say, you don't want people to own nature. You want to own the genetics. So you need to have an IP system that's fit for purpose. There's also the third issue I think we need to think carefully about is that of transparency. This is relevant to trade, it's relevant to consumer confidence. we need to have some transparency of the gene editing process in the market. So those are three things that I think we may well touch on in the conversation that follows, and I think are important issues to get right as we consider the change of law in gene editing. There's another issue that often comes up in these conversations that I want to mention now to preempt what I expect, some questions that I expect. And often in these sorts of forums, there's been a coupling between gene editing and animal welfare, with the assumption that if you can lower disease risk in animals, it will lead to a degradation in animal welfare. And I would just like to make clear my position on this, which is those are two completely different things. How you choose to look after your animals is one thing, a emotive subject, and I think we all have views about it. We want to look after animals well. Whether those animals are made by gene editing approaches or not is a completely different question, and those two things shouldn't be coupled together. If there's a coupling at all, it's actually that gene editing can lead to improvements in animal welfare because it can lower their illness and how often they're unwell, and it can also do things like make sure that you breed single sex where you need them, as has already been talked about a little bit here. So I think I'm going to leave it there. I've touched on some of what I see as the positives and how I think this technology can be so useful in the environment for sustainability. I touched on some of the issues that I think we should think about carefully before we make any change. And I'm very much looking forward to hearing the views from this crowd. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Gideon. May I just ask you 2 or 3 clarification questions before I hand over to Michael Antonio. Once a crop or an animal is gene edited, will it be possible to tell whether it has been or not?
That depends on the nature of the gene editing. There are some examples of minor gene editing where it will be impossible, and it could already be going on and you'd be unaware of it because you couldn't test the gene editing. You couldn't see the gene editing. More extensive gene editing processes might be genetically distinguishable. And that's one of the reasons why I think that both sides of my answer represent one of the reasons why I think transparency is important. Notification of what's been done in production would need to be an important aspect, I think.
So it would be true to say that farmers and growers might end up growing gene edited crops or keeping gene edited animals without being able to tell the difference whether they have or not.
Well, depending on the nature of the gene editing, but that is true.
And what would you say about the narrowing of the agricultural biodiversity gene pool? Do you think that's a risk?
Sorry, so it's a narrowing of the
gene pool. I mean, as you know, the gene pool of crops and animals in agriculture has already narrowed dramatically during my farming lifetime. Don't you think this is going to accelerate it?
I think it could actually increase the range of genetic material. And one of the wonderful aspects of gene editing is it enables you to look at wild varietals of crops and think about whether you can bring in some of the genetic diversity that is present there to your benefit. So I think we can use gene editing to see a broadening of genetic diversity in our crops rather than a narrowing.
What would you say to those who feel that the hubris of humanity and the scientific community in particular of redesigning plants and animals to suit their own purposes is going to be accelerated by gene editing?
Well, that's quite an ethical question, of course, and I would say that we have been doing this, of course, since the birth of agriculture. We have been breeding our crops and our livestock to suit our purposes. Everything that we eat pretty much now has been bred to suit our purposes, and this is more of the same. So
you think that because we've been doing it, it's okay to continue to do it, sort of thing?
I think that the benefits to the environment of continuing to make sure that our food is produced sustainably and to maximize productivity and to get maximum environmental benefits is worth it.
Last question, how are you going to take account of the responses to the consultation, or how is the government going to take account?
Well, there's a formal process that goes on as a consequence of all consultations. The government is required to publish a summary of the findings to the consultation, summary of the input to the consultation, and a governmental response that has to be within 3 months. and that process will initiate, that process is going on now, and the input will be considered by government. I expect that there will be some stakeholder engagement to pursue some of the issues that are raised, and we'll have to explore the subjects that I've mentioned, like regulation, IP, transparency in that process, as we consider what to do in response to the consultation.
Well, thank you very much for answering those questions so clearly. I'm now going to ask Dr. Michael Antonio, who, as I said, is from King's College in London, where he is head of gene expression therapy. Michael, over to you to respond.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Needless to say, or not needless to say, but I would challenge Gideon on just about everything that he said on from the wish list of what gene editing can do to claims of precision, predictability, and safety. First, my problems with gene editing, the way it is being researched and developed for applications in agriculture, my concerns are both technical and conceptual. Technically, gene editing is an artificial laboratory-based genetic modification procedure, which give rise by definition to genetically modified organisms. So it bears no resemblance to natural breeding, and whether gene editing mimics exactly what may happen through natural breeding is completely hypothetical. There has never been an experiment conducted to show whether an event, a trait developed through natural breeding and then through gene editing, that the two are absolutely identical and without any difference between the two. That is purely hypothetical. And I would say, since the procedure of natural breeding is completely different from gene editing, you will end up, even if you did, and there's no proof that this can happen, but even if you ended up with the same trait at the end of the day, the same characteristic, there will be unintended genetic effects that will be unique to the two sides of the two procedures. So I think that this is an important point to begin with, that when we consider gene editing, we must not neglect the procedure that is used to actually bring about a gene editing event in either a plant or an animal. Why is that important? Because it's procedure that informs us not only how we can achieve what we want, but also where genetic errors can creep in as well. And at the moment, those who are advocating for a change in the definition of a genetically modified organism to exclude certain gene editing outcomes, they are arguing that we should ignore procedure, but we do that at our peril. Because gene editing, is already a large body of evidence and an increasing body of evidence to show that gene editing can result in major unintended genetic damage to DNA, not only at locations in the DNA of the organism other than the intended gene editing site, but even at the gene editing site itself. These types of DNA damage can range from large deletions of DNA, large insertions of DNA, large rearrangements of DNA, the creation of new gene sequences that result in the production of new mutant proteins with unknown consequences. All of these outcomes are well documented. And what the advocates of gene editing in agriculture are suggesting is ignore the process that leads to these unintended mutations and just look at the end trait. This, for me, is being completely unscientific. It is ignoring the science that tells us that gene editing is neither precise, it is neither predictable, and therefore questions the safety. Why is that? Because what gene editing will almost invariably bring about is not just modification of one gene function, and that could be bad enough, but in all likelihood, modifications in the functions of multiple genes. When you change the patterns of gene function in an organism, you will alter its biochemistry. Now, if this is in the connection of plants, plant biochemistry is incredibly complex. And we know plants are actually very, very good at producing substances that are toxic. So it's not beyond the realms of possibility that in the effort to gene edit, the altered pattern of gene function could give rise to novel toxins and allergens, which will not, if those who advocate for deregulation of gene editing have their way, will never be tested for. So what I'm advocating here is, I'm not saying ban gene editing, but if you're going to use it, and there are very good reasons why you shouldn't, in addition to the technical ones I've just mentioned, keep it regulated. Acknowledge that you're producing GMOs. Keep it under the current GMO regulations. So at least we have a safety assessment, risk assessment for human health and the environment. And we keep labeling of the products on the marketplace. And just to follow up on what's something that Gideon said, if you actually know what gene editing event a given company has undertaken in a crop or an animal, if you know what that is, it's a trivial matter to devise a test to show whether that is present or not, regardless of what that is. It could be a single DNA-based unit change that you brought about by gene editing, but you could devise a test that will pick that up. That's something else that the law must demand. It must demand that any company that wants to launch a gene-edited product must disclose its nature so that tests can be put in place to monitor it through the food supply, so that those that want to avoid it can do so in confidence. So, and then when it comes to all these highly desirable characteristics that Gideon said will be good to have in our crops and our animals, I'm afraid I have to challenge, this big, I've heard this so often from advocates of gene editing, is a huge wish list of products. And I'm afraid that's all it is. It's a wish list. There's no guarantee that gene editing will produce drought-tolerant crops or saline-tolerant crops, heat-stressed, heat-resistant crops, or pathogen or high pathogen resistance or higher yields. No evidence of that at all. But there is the concept of modern genetics tells us that it's, for me, bound to fail. Gene editing is bound to fail to produce this. Why is that the case? And this is the major conceptual flaw that I feel is being ignored by the advocates of gene editing. Advocates of gene editing, just like those who produce the first generation transgenic GM crops, treat genes as isolated units of information. That is not how life is structured. Genes work as part of a complex network, a coordinated, highly sophisticated, highly coordinated network of functions. And we now know that complex traits of the type that Gideon advocated gene editing could produce don't have just one gene function at their basis, but many gene functions. In fact, the latest concept in molecular genetics says that complex traits, which things like high yield, pathogen resistance, and so on, are complex traits, may have the functioning of the entire genome of the organism in any given part at its basis, the entire organism, the entire genetic makeup. This is the concept of omnigenics. So complex traits are omnigenic traits. Gene editing, by manipulating one or two genes, cannot deliver as a result of complex traits. This is why I feel it will fail to deliver on these promises, just like first generation transgenics failed to deliver on their promises. And as a result, I feel we are wasting our time. We need to, if we think there's anything wrong with our crops and animals, and I don't believe there is, it's the system that's at fault. We need to change our system, not our crops. We need a system change. And for me, gene editing doesn't have a place in even conventional, let alone sustainable agriculture.
Thank you, Michael. If I may ask you to pause there, just to make sure we get everybody in. I want to ask you just two very brief questions.
Yes.
You're a gene editor yourself, are you not?
Yes, I do. With my collaborators, we use gene editing for medical applications.
So where is the boundary between acceptable gene editing and unacceptable gene editing?
I think for me, the boundary is actually quite clear. In medicine, gene editing is very targeted for a particular condition, and we're fully aware of the downsides of gene editing as well as the upsides. So the regulation, the safety, awareness of the safety, the unintended mutations that can happen, as well as the intended change, we're fully aware of this, and everything is in place for strict regulation. And it's very targeted to an individual who has a condition that could possibly be treated by gene editing or other types of gene therapy that I've been involved in for decades. Whereas in agriculture, what we're seeing is it's almost like a free-for-all. Gene edit the organism and put it out in the environment, and you won't be able to predict what the outcomes would be.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I did want to just ask you another question, which is that how do you think that if it does go ahead, it's going to interfere with people like myself who are, you know, fairly determined not to go down that road?
Well, this is the dilemma, I think, that both the consumer and the farmer that wants to avoid it are faced with. If gene-edited products with particular, it is two major classes of outcomes that are being attempted to be deregulated, which means there won't be any labeling, there won't be any obligation of the developer to actually label and disclose. Both the food manufacturers, the retailers, the consumer, and the farmer are not going to know. They're going to say, oh, here's this new variety of X, and you won't know how it's been produced. So I think this is why we need the regulation that's in place right now for first-generation transgenic crops must be maintained for the gene-edited crops as well. At the moment, they do fall under that regulation, and I feel that's the way it must remain, so that those that want to avoid it can do so.
Well, thank you very much, Michael. I'm now going to ask Guy Singh-Watson to respond. Guy, the floor is yours.
Patrick, I'm an organic farmer. I've been growing organic vegetables for 35 years. I think it was 2000, I took the government to court over a genetically modified maize trial bordering our farm, and got involved in the whole debate. I mean, at that time, I felt very strongly about the risks posed by GM crops, and I didn't think they were in any way balanced by the benefits. At the end of that, I did find myself on the steps of the High Court standing next to someone carrying a Frankenstein's food banner, and I actually became increasingly uncomfortable with both sides of the argument. The anti-GM thing, why do we have to use emotive terms like that? I found it anyway, and I'm afraid for me that made me back away from it, and I've made no comments about it for many years, because I guess actually in many ways I sit in the middle. I am not anti-GM crops, I'm not anti-gene editing, I'm just anti the direction that it seems to be taking agriculture on a global scale. But anyway, Dan Saladino persuaded me to speak on the food programme, so here I am today. I don't consider myself to be massively well informed on that, but on the technical side of it, and I'll leave that to Michael and Gideon. I just do want to, on a couple of comments, Gideon, about, you talked about the benefits, and it was a bit reminiscent of the benefits of GMOs. I really would like you to put the word potential in front of benefits, because when it comes to GMOs, they just haven't, all the benefits we were told about, they just haven't been delivered. They haven't increased yields. They haven't decreased pesticide use. In fact, they've increased pesticide use according to the USDA, and there's no evidence that they've increased yields. So, it's possible that they could have done if they'd been applied in a different way, but they haven't. And I suppose I feel it's likely that genome editing is likely to go in the same direction. And basically what gets adopted in agriculture is what people can make money out of. And, for the last 70 years, increasingly people have made money out of growing, monocrops of annuals, huge, loss of diversity and environmental damage, generally. And I guess that's what I've spent my lifetime trying to counter. And I'm pretty sure that genome editing is going to be another step along that path. I feel uncomfortable objecting to it on that basis because, one could use that argument for all sorts of things. And, basically I'm a libertarian and I think people should be able to innovate and change and use those instances. But there needs to be some sort of balance. Is that innovation? Is all that technical cleverness? Do we have the wisdom and do we have the regulatory controls to ensure that that's applied in a way which is beneficial to humankind and, to our planet? And I'm afraid that my answer to that is a resounding no, we don't. I'm not sure, I haven't got the answers. I don't want to see genome editing banned, but I do have, really serious concerns about the direction that is taking agriculture globally, and I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Guy. I do have a couple of questions for you. Dan Saladino got you on the food program, as you just said. I think he's on this Zoom call. And during the discussion, you said that you cited one example of a possible benefit of gene editing, and Professor Jonathan Jones, who's also on this Zoom call, just mentioned it in the chat, which is blight-resistant potatoes. As you know, I countered it in my blog by saying there are plenty of naturally bred blight-resistant varieties of potatoes already out there. So would you, if there was a gene-edited blight-resistant potato, sell it through Riverford?
If we were allowed to under organic rules, which as I understand we wouldn't be at the moment, I would consider it. I'd consult with our customers. You suggested on your blog, Patrick, that you could achieve the same results. In fact, the same results have been achieved through conventional breeding, and it's true there are varieties of potatoes that have very good blight resistance that are produced through conventional breeding. But the ones I've tasted taste horrible.
Well, I grew some last year, which were blight resistant.
Just let me finish, Patrick. And our customers thought they're horrible. I have heard from Dutch breeders that there are ones that taste better at the moment. But I don't think, Patrick, you can deny, if you take the best potato, for chipping, say a Maris Piper, which most people would love to be able to grow organically, but I think is virtually impossible. And if you could change that in the only way that it had blight resistance, and we could grow it in the same way, within the same agricultural systems, if I didn't have to buy it from, Monsanto, if I could buy it from a, Scottish plant breeder or something, independent breeder, I would feel pretty comfortable with that, Patrick. Actually, I would, yeah.
And would you want the variety to be labelled as being gene edited, so that Riverford customers would know?
Yes, I would. But I think, again, you need to be a little bit careful about the sort of precedents you're getting there in asking someone to, label, are we going to ask everything to be labeled that's marginally different to everything else? Again, I think there does have to be a risk-benefit assessment there. But yes, I guess in principle, people should be able to make their decisions what they eat, and if they have a philosophical resistance to it, and I suppose my resistance to genome editing and the application of it is almost philosophical, then they should be able to, guide that, have that guide their purchasing. So yeah, I guess I think it should be labelled on the whole. I'm arguing myself there.
Thank you very much, Guy. No doubt you may have some other cross-questioning to do to the other panelists after they've spoken, but the last panelist has spoken. But thank you very much for sharing your position on this. Now we're going to go to Lawrence Woodward. I've already given him an introduction. Lawrence, you have the floor.
Thank you. Very interesting exchanges so far. I'd just like to reiterate or to clarify a couple of things that have come up and have been presented in a slightly different way. Let's just be clear, genome editing is not banned. There's no ban on genome editing. It's allowed. It's allowed under EU regulations, and currently it's allowed under UK regulations. it's allowed, but it has to be labeled. It has to go through a regulatory process of monitoring and assessment and safety checks. Some of us might think that that's not rigorous enough or robust enough, but it is there. No one is stopping the development of genome editing. What we're currently facing in the UK is not the prospect of a ban on genome editing at all. What we're faced with in the UK is a prospect of actually completely, that's how it's been presented, deregulating, taking genome editing out of regulatory scrutiny, out of the requirements of transparency, out of the requirements for thorough health and safety checks, and out of the requirements for labeling. That's the issue. No one's talking about banning it at all. It's actually the debate about is whether it should be removed. Now, we have to recognize, everyone has to recognize that genome editing technology is a technology, a science, which is marvelous. I mean, the whole development of genome genetic science has been remarkable in the last few years. And developments, for example, of sequencing, genetic sequencing, and the development of marker tools and so on are excellent and can be used for all kinds of purposes, whether that's industrial agriculture or even for organic or agroecological agriculture. My own old institution's development of population breeding made use of mapping techniques developed by John Innes Centre and others, and we work closely with them. So that technology has real benefits. But as Michael said, the move to deregulate genome editing is a major move and is a new shift, a new paradigm shift. It's a different shift, and it is. I mean, the science, no question, is marvelous and is. If you want to be, there's two terms you can use. One is it's transformative, potentially transformative, and it's potentially disruptive. It could have a major impact, not just on agriculture, but in all parts of society. With that in mind, I think what Gideon said at the end, that we have to think about and consider genome editing, is a really good and positive thing to say. We have to think about it, we have to consider it, we have to take into account all the different aspects, all the different ramifications of this potentially disruptive and transformative technology. Unfortunately, that's not happening. What's happening is a political decision in the UK to rush ahead, tick box exercises, the presentation of a consultation at a very curious time in terms of our national life, a consultation which does not meet the Cabinet Office guidelines in terms of public consultation, a consultation that is prejudiced, that's presented statements and assertions, claims about the science, claims about the benefits without any clear review, and critically a consultation, one area where it does not meet the guidelines is the presentation of a proper cost and benefit analysis of the different scenarios under which this technology should be developed. So we're not having the considered, intelligent, detailed, extensive discussion and public debate that we should have over such a powerful technology. In the year 2000, on GM itself, we had a thing called the GM Nation debate. That was several years of scientific research looking at the farm scale evaluation trials, looking at the performance in the field. We had proper reviews about the science, about the risks, about monitoring, transparency, and we had a proper review and consultation about the business and commercial case. And that was followed up by a 8-9 month public debate, sponsored discussions, grassroots engagement discussions about GM technology. That happened. Why? If that happened then, why can't it happen now? Why are we having this rushed tick box exercise consultation with the Prime Minister and ministers already clear about their decision? It's just is unintelligent. It doesn't make sense. That's clear. Now, I mean, Michael outlined the fact that what has not come out in any government statements, and actually any statements in the consultation, that the science of this technology is contested. It's not clear cut. Statements in the consultation information document that scientists are clear on, scientists say this. Actually, it's not. The science is contested. The risk-benefit analysis is contested. Wherever you sit on the side, whichever side of the fence you sit on, both these propositions need to be tested and debated clearly and openly with proper assessments. That is simply not happening. Michael again made the point that that these claims are claims. They may be potential things. Things might happen like this, but they're potential. You can't say that this will happen. And the thing that is also missing, which people are just forgetting about totally, is that there is no one gene editing. There's no one approach to gene editing. Where Gideon says, and others say it, that gene editing mimics nature. It mimics nature. It's a nature identical process. Well, one aspect, one approach, you might argue that. I think you have a hard time arguing it, but you might. But three of the four approaches, certainly not. And two very definitely fall within the category of GMOs. And people working in the field recognize that they're GMOs. So we need to be clear about definitions. In any event, no gene editing, genome editing mimics nature. It's not a natural process. It's as Michael said, it's a lab-based process. What it might do is produce an effect that could be produced by traditional breeding, but would not really be produced except over a period of evolution in nature itself. So the presentations are really not clear cut. Now, whether it's of benefit, I should just be clear that unlike Guy, most people in the organic and agroecological sector feel and argue there is no place for this technology in organic or agroecology. Conceptually, it's completely out. The whole different approach to how organisms work, whole organisms, how they link together, is the antithesis of genome editing. So that does not fit. But there are also plenty of conventional farmers, conventional producers, who might not want to see a ban on the technology and might want to see farmers being able to use it, but they certainly would not want to use it themselves. We have a whole food system which is working towards more transparency, provenance, artisanal food, and so on. Now, those producers need to be protected. People who want to buy those foods need to be protected. Therefore, we have to have clear transparency, clear labeling, and a system that properly separates, which means we have to have a system of coexistence. And there is no clarity whatsoever in the consultation document or any statements by ministers that indicate that they are concerned seriously and willing to look at and develop properly a system of coexistence, or a proper regulatory system that recognizes that, and a proper system of transparency and labeling that recognizes that. And all of these kinds of things have implications for markets, for food choice, for trade. These things are not really being considered. The statements by ministers from the Prime Minister downwards are unbelievably depressing, disappointing, unintelligent. We need to be better. We were better than this in 2000. We need to at least deal with that. And we also need to copy some of the things that are happening in countries like Norway, where the debate and the discussion, the regulatory processes being developed involve democracy, transparency, and citizens at all stages of the process.
You're on mute, Patrick, I think.
Sorry about that. Yes. Thank you very much indeed, Lawrence. I do have one question, which is that I took you to task in my blog for suggesting, and I think you felt that it was kind of slightly, I misrepresented you in what I said, that you had indicated that there might be some circumstances in which gene editing might convey advantages to farmers who use a lot of pesticides, and therefore if a gene edited crop was developed which should enable them to reduce their pesticide use, that would be a good thing. That isn't quite what you said, or is it?
No, it's not quite what I said. I don't think you listened too closely there.
Sorry
or
about
maybe
that.
Dan's editing wasn't so precise. I said there are farmers who believe that. And there are farmers who see that genome editing can be a tool towards greater sustainability, whatever that means. And there is a really degenerated term. Who knows what sustainability means? But certainly some farmers believe that. And some farmers believe it could be used, the tool could be used as a transition to greater sustainability and even a move to agroecology. They believe that. I'm not convinced by those arguments. I certainly do not see them stacking up at all for organic or agroecological agriculture. I think if that were to be the case, that the tool could be used for greater sustainability, then how the tool is used, which aspect of it needs to be clearer. We can't just talk about gene editing in broad terms. We have to be precise about what we mean by that, and we have to be precise about the terms and conditions. And that actually means major changes in the structure as to how research is funded and the structure of commercial rollouts, the structure of licensing, and so on. Because there's no question the pathway this technology is on the same old pathway. How it's used will be most used to further industrialize and intensify agriculture. The rollout, although there's people to keep talking about small companies and small medium enterprises sort of developing and venture companies and so on, the model is they start and then they're all bought up. And you get more and more power into fewer and fewer hands. The licensing system, the patent system does that. So this technology is on the same trajectory as more intensification, greater corporate control. And so you can't talk about the tool in the toolbox without saying, you know, what tool, whose tool, who uses it, who's the tool.
Are you comfortable using that argument, Lawrence, when you could use exactly the same about just about any other industry, particularly the IT industry? I mean, why are we singling out genome editing for this criticism? I completely agree with what you're saying, but I'm a bit uncomfortable using it as an argument, you know, for one particular industry.
Well, personally, I'm not using it for one particular industry at all. I mean, I think it is across the board, and I think as far as agriculture is concerned, and the food system, which is what we're talking about, it's perfectly okay to use those arguments and legitimate, because that's what we're talking about. But the other problem is.
Sorry, can I interrupt? I just would love to have a chance to come back on some of
Yes, I was going to say, Gideon, I think you have absolutely earned the right by listening to these three interventions to come back and pick up on some of the challenges that have been shared. So please do. And Guy and Lawrence, you do come in as well, but I think Gideon should have a chance to say something.
And that was a fascinating debate that was starting there, but I could see that might run and run, and I really would like to come back on some of the issues that I've heard in those three really interesting other presentations. I'll pick up on a few of the strands, hopefully, not all, because there was a lot of content there. One of the questions, I think it was one of the issues that I think Michael raised, was the risk in gene editing approaches of off-target issues. So you try and make a change, but you get changes in the genome that are not where you want them. Now, to me, that's one of the possible benefits of genome editing, is that when you use some existing breeding techniques where you intentionally stress the crop by irradiation or by chemical treatment, you generate a very large range of mutations in that process, most of which are off target. gene editing enables you to be much more precise with your interventions, but that doesn't mean that you assume you're right. You still have to look, obviously, in detail to check that the changes you've made are correct, and to check thoroughly that you don't have off-target traits that are introduced. So clearly there would need to be a system that checks for those sorts of off-target things in gene editing, as there is in traditional breeding. You can't just breed something and look for the one trait you're interested in and not check that there are not other harmful traits at the same time in breeding otherwise.
So are you saying, Gideon, that we should have process-based regulation then?
I think I'd like to just carry on with my response. There's a lot of points raised there, and we could go down any one of these angles, but I would like to just respond to several of the points raised.
Please do, please do.
A second, an issue that, so clearly there needs to be care about the use of gene editing. That's abundantly clear to me. And one area that I thought was very interesting in your questions, Patrick, to Michael, were Michael's differentiation between the fact that it was okay to use this set of techniques for human health applications because there things were understood and there was sufficient regulation, but not to use the same wonderful toolbox of genetic tools for benefit to the environment. And I think that I would push back on that argument and say that we should be looking at the use of these tools, but we need to do so carefully. We need to be aware of the need to regulate and understand things. Now, one issue that again was mentioned by several people is that we don't actually know that these approaches work. And I think it's probably a fair accusation, Guy, that I probably should say potential in front of some of these applications because we don't yet know that they don't yet have examples of them. But we do have examples of quite a number of crops and livestock where gene editing has been used successfully to generate significant advantages. There are tomatoes which are on the market in Japan where gene editing is allowed that have human health benefits because their vitamin content. We know that there has been a pig bred which is immune to a porcine respiratory virus through gene editing. In Argentina, where gene editing has been legal for the last 4 years, and therefore as a nice case study, we've looked at it for the last 4 years. There's been a lot of crops that have been developed there which have benefits, acknowledged and demonstrated benefits to productivity and to herbicide resistance and to human health. And I'm probably missing some others as well. So they're demonstrated crops that have benefits through the application of gene editing. So I think it is fair to say that some of these are only potential, but the potential has been realized in quite a lot of areas, and doubtless there's potential to do more.
Don't you think that, what would you say to Lawrence's point against that? And it's something that I'm concerned about as well, which is that all the examples you gave and are widely given about gene editing are treating the symptoms of outcomes which are related to unsustainable, sorry to use the word, Lawrence, it is in our organization's name, practices in the first place. In other words, if you've got a sick animal, you could either look at what's wrong with its nutrition or husbandry, or you could gene edit it so that you suppress the illness. Don't you think it's a kind of suppression of a problem which is manifesting in the imbalance of the crop or the animal itself due to husbandry?
Maybe I'll come on to that issue at the end of my responses. So the farm system is an interesting addition. And actually the next point that I wanted to raise in response was around the diverse response of farmers and the farming community, where there has been quite broad support for gene editing, but of course not universal. And the conversation we're having today demonstrates that. I think there's a very wide range of views, even within organic farming. And I was interested in the piece in The Grocer that Alex Smith wrote, for instance, saying, identifying some of the benefits and potential benefits to organic farming in particular. So I think there is not a unified view of this in the farming community. And we should be aware of the fact that many farmers, including some who are coming from a position of really nurturing the environment and being concerned about sustainability, also consider there's a role for gene editing.
I just want to intervene.
I would like to just remind you of the 3 things that I said at the beginning, where I felt we need real care in this process if we're going to change the law around gene editing. And the first of those was around regulation. Lawrence made the point that it's already it's legal to do gene editing at the moment, but with very strict regulation. We would obviously continue to need regulation, and there is regulation already in existence for the release of things to the environment and for novel foods. It's a question of assessing how you would navigate either the existing or a modified regulatory system to make sure that human health and environmental safety was maintained. That's absolutely crucial. Second thing I raised was intellectual property, and that's been touched on here, and I think it's really important. We absolutely have to be clear about how that would work. It's interesting in the Japanese example that gene editing is being pursued nearly entirely by small and medium enterprises, in contrast to GMO in the same country, which is largely being pursued by the multinationals. Of course, multinationals can buy the SMEs, but it's a much more vibrant workplace for gene editing because of the ease of the application of this tool. So the IP issues are really quite different, I think, from GMO. And the third thing that I said we need to think about carefully, and I persist in this, was transparency. We need to be clear about how these products are going to be notified and how we're going to know about them in the marketplace. And that has implications for trade and for consumers. So I just repeat that I recognize those as issues. A lot of the questions we've had here are around those issues, and they are all important issues to raise. On the farming system, I can see Guy wants to come in as well, but on the farming system which you raised, Patrick, I would never advocate that we should be using gene editing to solve all our problems. I think it's one of the tools we might use, and we should insert that into a diverse farming system, and different approaches will be used in different situations. So I would, your belief about which farming system is best is a much wider debate than the one narrowly about gene editing. But I see it as part of a diverse farming system.
Well, could I just say that some of the concerns about gene editing have been expressed on the chat, and I'd like to take this opportunity to say that we will record the chat, and if you want to express your views on the chat, maybe send the chat to you, Gideon, afterwards, so that even though the consultation is closed, perhaps you'll be perhaps you might take it into account.
Well, anyway, it's 450 people on it.
Can somebody go off mic?
How are you doing? I'm all right. Yeah.
So somebody's mic is on.
Is it Angela?
Because I'm finding the same thing. Yeah, I'm doing less and less.
If the convener can find, I think it's solved. Right.
Thank you. So even if it's only for after the event, perhaps this chat would be a way of communicating some of the issues to DEFRA and to the consultation process.
I'd be happy to receive it, and I have been reading it with interest during this conversation as well. Lots of interesting points.
Okay, so now I'm going to ask, before I go more widely, just very briefly, Lawrence, Guy, Michael, do you want to ask or make any comments to Gideon before we open things up?
Okay, just a very quick point. Gideon mentioned Alex Smith's interview in The Grocer. In fact, Alex Smith didn't say that, and he came on the chat just now saying, I didn't say there's any benefits to organic farming. What Alex actually said was that the pressure of and the lobbying and the profile and the push, he didn't think that the old style ban on going for a ban on gene editing, he thought gene editing was going to happen and you couldn't win that. He certainly didn't say there was benefits for organic farming, but he did recognize some potentials that needed to be examined. And I think that's a real point. I mean, there may well be benefits. There may well be benefits for some forms of industrialized agriculture, but it is going down that trajectory. And just one point about IP. The IP is certainly important, but the other corollary to this is where is the power for commercial rollouts? I mean, if you look at the developments, some small medium enterprises certainly are doing it, but they join in with larger corporations for commercial rollouts. You don't make money unless you do that. And the work that's being funded by the various pig breeders, for example, with institutes like Roslin Institute, are all about commercial rollouts, and they're controlling the technology not through IP but through contract, through the product contract. It's a bit of a myth that we can disseminate this and it can be widely available.
Thank you, Guy.
I've just got to take issue with Gideon saying that you said very assertively that genome editing was completely not, separate issue from animal welfare, and animal welfare could be regulated separately. I just find that absolutely incredible from my experience of farming that you can say that. I mean, if someone can gene edit a cow to produce more milk, cows will produce more milk, they'll divert more of their energy into milk production, and their welfare will suffer. I don't know how you can regulate that. Similarly, if a pig, produces 18 piglets rather than 14, they will definitely produce 18 piglets. I mean, that's how our economic system works. So I don't see how you can sit there, with claiming to be a kind of impartial scientist and say that. I mean, I just find it incredible. To my mind, it sort of undermines, a lot of the other things you're saying, and it just makes you sound like a lobbyist, I'm afraid, I get equally annoyed with the other side of the argument, but that is just not a credible argument.
Gideon, do you want to respond?
Yeah, no, well, thanks for the challenge. It's a fair challenge. Let me just first of all apologise if I did misrepresent Alex Smith earlier. I'm misremembering and confusing a couple of organic conversations that I've had in that case. But to Guy's response, I mean, I think that many of the decisions we make about animal welfare are independent, and the number of, I've said this before, it may even be in the food programme, the number of chickens that you choose to put in a shed and the nature of the ventilation that you put in that shed and the number of windows and things are independent decisions, regardless of the type of chickens you put into that shed.
What are the forces that have shaped how our chickens are kept? The argument is often used by farmers, we wouldn't keep them in a way that they would be unhealthy. Our interest is the animal welfare. Well, you're enabling them, the pig respiratory one being an absolute classic example. You're enabling them to keep them closer together with poorer ventilation, and someone will.
Well, you are enabling them, but you can also regulate to allow require the farmers not to do that. And so you can separate the issue of how you look after your animals from how the animals are produced. It is possible to do that, and that was the point I was trying to make.
There may be certain cases of density, for instance, with chickens, or the size of a battery cage, some very crude things that you can put in place. In terms of the general welfare of the animal, I disagree with you. And coming from a point of view of practically seeing the impact of developing technologies combined with the economic forces that farmers have to work under, food is produced the way that is cheapest to produce it on the whole. And if that...
Well, look, thank you, Guy, for making these points. And thank you, Gideon, for listening. We respect you being here and listening. I want to ask Michael, before I open it up, just Michael, if you've got anything short to challenge or to come back to Gideon on.
Yes, thank you, Patrick. Again, I'd like to pick up on what Gideon said about how he feels there's more damage from radiation or chemical-induced mutagenesis compared to gene editing. But I think, Gideon, you need to be aware of all of the steps of gene editing. It's not just the action of the gene editing tool that's causing unintended mutations, and not just off target, but also on target. You get mutations from just the tissue culture phase. You get additional mutations on top of that arising from the transformation process. And then you've got the gene editing tool, unintended events on top of that. In one of the rare studies that has been completed comparing outcome from natural breeding to gene editing, the fraction of genetic alterations from a natural breeding event to gene editing was a fraction. There were many hundreds of outcomes from the procedure at all of its stages, compounding, to bring about unintended mutations, both off target and on target. And these, we must regulate to make sure these are not missed. And the point about, apart from the fact that radiation and chemical-induced mutagenesis may produce mutations, they are, first of all, seen as GM events and are regulated as GM, but they're exempted from the GM regulation because they're seen as somehow having a history of safe use, even though they constitute a tiny fraction of all the breeding that goes on. But the point about gene editing, and natural breeding has a history of safe use as well. The point about gene editing is it doesn't have a history, let alone a history of safe use. It's been around for about 10 years. And yet here we are with a government that wants to completely deregulate certain aspects of gene editing so it becomes a free-for-all without any history of safe use to back it up. I find this absolutely extraordinary. And also, please bear in mind, you mentioned about the blight-resistant potato. Some mutations can be bred out. If you're producing a gene-edited crop or a GM crop of any sort, you can breed out some, but not all of the mutations that arose through the GM procedure or the gene-edited procedure, but not for something like potatoes. Going back to with something like vegetables, fruits that are vegetatively propagated, all the mutations that arise through the procedure at all of its stages will carry through to the final marketed product. This is why we have to do thorough characterization at all levels of molecular composition and function of the gene-edited product before we can convince ourselves that, yes, this is a safe entity that be considered for marketing. I'm sorry, this is what the science is telling us, and to ignore it, and we ignore that at our peril.
Well, thank you, Michael. Do you want a very brief response, Gideon, and then we'll open it up?
Yeah, sure. We're going to run out of time, aren't we? Inevitably.
Yes, we
so I acknowledge that you get off-target genetic changes in some applications of gene editing, and I didn't try and say otherwise. You get fewer than you do in mutagenesis, but you still need to check for them and be very careful that you understand what you have created. You can't create something and just chuck it out into the environment. And throughout this, I hope I've been absolutely clear that you still need to have a level of rigor and care, and you need to have a regulatory system that will ensure that level of rigor and care, so that you protect human health through the food that we eat, and you protect the environment. And that is an absolute given. So the comments that what is being suggested is a complete removal of any regulation from gene editing, I'm afraid that's not correct. Food is regulated already, and GM is regulated already, and the question is, where in a regulatory framework might GE best sit?
So you might be advocating for ongoing strict regulation of any gene-edited crops which are developed, might you?
That's something that is being considered, and the consultation input will help inform that, as will, I assume, for ongoing stakeholder engagement. There's a consideration of whether the law for gene editing should be relaxed relative to GM, but that does not mean you take it out of regulatory systems completely.
But the lobbyists are arguing for trait rather than process-based regulation. And this is the danger. By ignoring the process and focusing solely on the trait, you will miss doing the thorough characterization properly as part of that regulatory process. This is the danger I'm trying to highlight here.
Thank you for getting that across, and it's great that you're airing these concerns, and it's great that Gideon is listening. So now, on that note, can I ask Adele Jones, who hopefully has been distilling out a few pithy questions, to share them with us? Adele.
Thank you, Patrick, and brilliant discussion so far. There's been a very rich conversation going on in the chat, and I can't expect you all to answer these in the last few minutes, but maybe you can touch on them in some concluding remarks. A lot of it has been covered, I think, by the conversation, but there's some questions on one side about whether or not the precautionary principle is slowing down innovation, given the current state of the planet and farming on a global scale. On the other foot, there's a lot of questions about whether or not we're treating the symptom rather than the cause with gene editing, and whether or not it's the system of farming that we really should be focusing on. There's been quite a lot of questions about how freedom of choice and how the public and citizens, as Lawrence said, is happening in Norway, can feed into this process. And Gideon, whether there's any plans that the UK government has to open up that dialogue, I suppose, in a little more of a user-friendly way for the general public.
Shall we stop there for a sec? Well, otherwise we'll forget all the questions. So any of those anybody wants to respond to? Gideon, would you like to respond to them?
I'm not sure. No, I think Adele's doing a great job of summarizing what the nature of the questions were. I mean, why don't we let Adele carry on?
Okay, carry on, Adele.
I just had one more theme because I didn't want to bombard you all. But again, there was quite a lot of questions about avoiding unintended consequences. So thinking about how genetically modified crops designed to tolerate glyphosate, for example, have actually increased the use of pesticide usage in some parts of the world. There was another example given of the impact of US corn, which has lost the ability to signal the beneficial nematodes when corn rootworm attacks. How can we make sure we're solving one problem, we're not introducing others? So I think probably there's enough there to keep us going for the rest of the conversation. And of course, everyone, we will follow up by sharing the recording of this session, as well as the questions in the chat, and try and answer as many as we can afterwards.
So any of you want to respond to what's been shared by Adele? Yes, Guy.
Yeah, I just want, in terms of the slowing down innovation and so on, I do think it would be a tragedy to consign this technology to, well, I mean, for us to not lead it, really. It does seem to be something which in the UK we're good at, and I'd love to see us thrive and have the economic benefits that come with that. And and personally, I feel it does have huge potential to be beneficial to us all, but it just all depends on how it's applied. And I hope it can be applied in tandem with a more agroecological approach to agriculture. I don't see them as being totally inconsistent, but in practice they do seem to be. I don't see why they should be, but in practice they do seem to be.
Well, Gideon, I know you needed to leave at 5:15, so I think it would be right for you to have some closing words. I mean, we could keep the conversation going on longer without you, but let's hear what you've got to say before you need to leave.
Adele didn't mention this, but I'm going to pick on one question that's just come up because I want to put this right. And this is a question from David Hardwick saying, I have to take the line I'm taking because it's my job. And I just want to refute that quite fully. I certainly did not need to come on this call at 4 o'clock on a Friday on my Oxford day because it's my job. And I am here as to express the views that I have as an individual, and that's why I've chosen to come on here, not because I'm DEFRA chief scientist. And so, having said that, let me just reiterate what I said right at the very beginning of my remarks, that I care very deeply about our response to the climate challenge and the biodiversity challenge. And I see that GE is one technology, one approach that we can use to help us respond to those, to improve our environment, improve our food productivity, and improve our food system. I recognise that we do need to be careful with it. We need to be careful to think about regulation and IP and transparency in particular. But I do think it's something that we should be looking at carefully, and where there is scope to relax the regulation, not remove it, but relax the regulation, to allow it to be used to our advantage and solve some of our major challenges. I think I'll stop my remarks there. Thanks very much.
Okay, well, Gideon, you'll see in the chat, there's a great deal of respect for you having come into this lion's den of challenge, and we really appreciate it. And I must say, I think that these Zoom meetings, I mean, it would have been very hard to organize a meeting with this many people listening to you, having this amazing animated exchange without Zoom. So this is one of the benefits. I think it is democratizing debates of this kind to a degree. So thank you very, very much for participating. And I do hope that you will take account of some of the issues that the panelists have raised, but also the issues that have been raised on the chat.
I certainly will. I've been reading the chat with a great deal of interest. Thank you for inviting me, and I look forward to further such conversations in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you
Now,
very much.
Thank you.
We don't have to close immediately. So if anybody, Lawrence, you had your hand up. Do you want to say something? Because I think this is an incredibly powerful discussion. And for me, I care so passionately about this that I don't want things to remain unsaid if they need to be said by you or others on this Zoom.
Yeah, I would. I think it's good Gideon came on, and I think it's right that it's good that you acknowledge that and the difficulty. Beyond GM for the last 3 years we've been holding meetings with researchers, genetic engineers, and researchers and developers and farmers from across the spectrum under Chatham House rule. And what we found is, yeah, of course, people have their different viewpoints, their different set of values, but we have found a lot of common ground between people who we thought were polar opposites. And one of the things is that that we found from the side of people who are involved in genetic technologies and genome editing is that they are embarrassed by the hype of the technology. It causes them problems. They believe the technology is being overhyped, in part, certainly by politicians and policymakers, but also in part by the PR departments of their own research institutes and universities. Because the way that science, the way that technology, the way that research is funding, you've got to declare and highlight, you know, you're saving the world, your particular piece of research is saving the world, this is it. So there's a huge amount of overhype, which actually people, in reality, individuals don't buy into and are embarrassed by. There's also a kind of common thing with people. They say, well, you know, this is a technology. It's not the silver bullet. And we have to look at the wider context and the wider connotations. But what they say in those meetings is different to what they have to say in these kinds of public presentations and these consultations. And that's what's so depressing about this consultation, is that it hasn't built on those kinds of exchanges. It's thrown everyone back into the bunkers and the silos that were so destructive about citizen engagement and informed citizen discussion. And it's been thrown back because the political announcements by the Prime Minister and by the Minister, and the way in which DEFRA as officials, as scientists, presented the information in the consultation. It's simply not good enough. So we think, you know, the way forward is, yeah, there are people who believe that this technology will deliver. There are people who believe this technology won't deliver, and there are people who think it's not for me, but you know, other people can have it and develop it if they want. And you know, the science is contested. We have to take that into account. So we, as a society, have to demand that we do this consultation properly. And what we would like to see, what Beyond GM has been proposing, is that we stop this process now and we replace it with a UK-wide inquiry and consultation, not just England. Why on earth we have a consultation based on England when it's a UK-wide issue is beyond me. So we have a UK-wide inquiry. We have an independently assessed review of all the science and the safety aspects, and have an outside the bunker, outside the silos assessment and review of the science. We have an independent review of the social and ethical and the economic claims and impacts, including trade of the technology, and a consideration of different scenarios as to how the technology would affect UK agriculture and the food system. And we have an independent review of the regulatory frameworks that involve transparency, labeling, and coexistence with other approaches. And we have a proper public discussion along the lines of GM Nation, leading to a green paper which the government actually sets out in detail what it proposes to do, not hides behind cliches. So that's what I think we can get back to, a sensible, rational, intelligent discussion outside of the silos and bunkers.
Well, look, Lawrence, you've sort of answered the question that I was going to ask each of you, just to conclude this, because I think we've had such a rich discussion. It's so important. So I'm going to ask the other three of you, well, two of you now, sorry. Do you think that the government are going to force this through? That's the first question. And secondly, if it does go through, Lawrence has just answered the question in a way, what we need to do about that. Because if you look at the history of GM crops, I mean, obviously they've been restricted in the UK, but in North and South America, they've been widely grown, still are widely grown. And yet one has the feeling that we're at the end of a road of the industrialization of agriculture, and there'll have to be a sort of turning point where we start to rein back on some of the terrible things that we've inflicted on the planet during this period. So what's your, looking ahead, how do you see this panning out in relation to gene editing? So first question, is it going to be forced through? And secondly, what can we do as concerned citizens to try to move back towards a more harmonious relationship between food and farming and the planet. I'll start with you, Guy.
Is it going to be forced through? Yes. What can we do about it? I mean, it would really help if you've got people like Gideon on a farm. I assume he has been on a farm, but he just seemed to be woefully naive about that, you know, the interface of, you know, of technology and, well, I suppose capitalism, really, you know, of how it will be applied. I mean, because, you know, I thought his comment about animal welfare was beyond the pale, really. But I don't know, Patrick. I don't know this. You know, I want to say, I don't have a problem with the technology. Actually, I accept what you're saying, Michael. And there's a whole load of stuff that I just don't know about. This seems to be something that we're good at. I mean, God, we need something, and you know, as a nation, and I would like to see, you know, us thrive. And I do think it could be applied. I don't think it's necessarily intrinsically, you know, antagonistic with the sort of agriculture that most of us want to see, a more agroecological approach. I don't see why they can't, but it just in practice, you know, working through the capitalist system, it is, you know, it's a lot easier to make money out of a GMO than it is out of, you know, planting trees in a pasture or whatever, or something that much more complex integrated system. And I you know, I really don't know the answer to that. So.
Well, thank you for that. I see Mary Mees just said chemical companies are going to turn to biotech. Is that right, Michael? What's your answer to the question of whether it'll be forced through? And then secondly, what do you think we need to do in the future to move towards a better balance between our intervention through farming and food and the health and harmony of us and the planet?
Yes, thank you. Regrettably, I have to agree with Guy that I think the government is going to force this change in the law, come what may. The decisions for me are political rather than anything to do with the science. And that's what worries me most. Again, as a scientist, I'm not supposed to make political statements. Really, I'm supposed to stay out of it. But this technology is so embedded within the politics, it's virtually impossible for me to talk about it without reference to the political context in which this consultation has taken place, which I believe is to align our legislation with that of the United States, to allow the free passage of GM and gene-edited products into the UK unimpeded. This is the only thing that makes sense to me. And also, of course, the fact that gene-edited products are patentable. Whether you're an academic or in a research institute or an industry, the first thing that you will do when you generate a possible commercializable gene-edited crop or animal, you will patent it. Your university will even demand you, even if you're an academic, your university may demand you to do that. So you cannot separate the commercial political component from this development. And for me, the worrying thing is the way that the science is being ignored. I've tried to raise issues about the science that I feel are being neglected in the push to deregulate. But you know, the basic science, the modern concepts of genetics, what they're informing us, which is the foundation of any technology. The fact that the latest concepts in molecular genetics are telling us, and also and then the very well characterized unintended outcomes from gene editing, these laboratory-based procedures, and how they're so radically different from natural breeding, which has a phenomenal history of safe use in our hands, which is completely lacking in the gene-edited GM area. This is what worries me. So I think in future, we need to try to get people to think in this broader context so that we place the technology within the broad field of basic science so that then we can see it. And then beyond that further, to place it within the agricultural systems. I'm so glad people like Guy here and Lawrence and yourself, in that, for me, the problems are not with our crops, our seeds, or not with our animals. It's the system which is the problem. We need to change the system to a climate resilient system. Our aspirations to produce climate ready crops is a fantasy that I would lay a wager on we will never achieve. How about this pig? I'll finish on this. This pig that's been gene edited to make it more resistant to respiratory viral infection. How long do you think it will take for a viral variant to come along that will overcome that genetic obstruction? 1 year? Maybe you're lucky, you might get 2 years out of it. No, that's what we're facing with here. You need to change the system. As was it Guy who mentioned? Separate out, have humane practices in the agricultural system, and then you don't have to think about editing X, Y, or Z. Because what we have huge variety already. And natural breeding, if there's any gaps, natural breeding is the way to deliver, because that brings together the totality of the genetics that's needed to bring about desirable complex traits. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Michael, but thank you, Lawrence and Guy as well. And in his absence, thank you, Gideon. This has been a really stimulating and rich conversation, and an important one, I think, in the absence of a decent consultation due to COVID and many other factors over this gene editing thing. And as you all said, it does seem likely that the government will force it through. So I'm going to end by thanking you all, and particularly thank you to all the people who joined this Zoom. I'm not sure how many it was in the end, but 459 were registered before it started, which is an amazingly large number of people. So there's obviously a massive interest in this. And what I've loved about it is that there are so many people like Jonathan Jones and others who are pro gene editing, who stayed with the call and participated in the chat. So thank you all very, very much. We're going to do more of these because I think it's just one of the legacies of COVID is that we're going to be able to have these big meetings in a virtual way. And I think that there can be a real benefit from them. So now I'm just, in conclusion, I'm going to jump out of my moderator's relative impartiality and say that for me, this is all about health. This is about positive health. And what I feel about those who promote new technologies to treat this, cure that, or make something else resistant, is that they forget that what Howard said, that health is the birthright, or should be the birthright, of every living organism. And after having farmed for nearly 50 years here, I feel as if I know less, not more, about what this impulse of health is. But I feel that somehow in the natural world, we can observe this impulse manifesting in nature. And I feel that it's really important to work in harmony with nature rather than to sort of suppress it or treat the symptoms which our own wrong agricultural practices have caused in the plants and animals we look after. So that is a very unimpartial way to end the meeting, but to be continued. And thank you all, particularly, as I say, to the people who possibly were not in the minority on this Zoom call for participating. So until soon, and we will share, we'll have the chat available. If anybody wants to, I don't know how we'll do it, but the chat will be downloadable from our website, and we'll also send it to Gideon and Deborah, and let's do more of these. Thank you very much indeed. And thank you again, panelists.